Hey, how's it going, everyone? My name is Spencer Smith, and thanks for tuning back into my channel. Today, I just wanted to give a couple of my thoughts on the recent debate between Don K. Preston and Dr. Richard Carrier on the Myth Vision podcast. Just recently, Derek Lamberg at Myth Vision hosted a debate between Don K. Preston and Dr. Richard Carrier on the topic of, did Jesus get it wrong on the end times? Now, what I found interesting about that topic or subject of the debate was that Richard Carrier would agree to that topic. Because I'm led on to believe from Richard, at least from what I read and heard from him, that he doesn't even believe Jesus existed. He believes Jesus was a myth, which is an extreme radical form of skepticism. But it's kind of odd that he would show up to a debate debating the topic of, did Jesus get it right on the end times or wrong on the end times? Because the topic already assumes that Jesus existed. So I find it odd that he would show up to a debate when he doesn't even believe Jesus existed. Why would he show up to a debate to debate if Jesus got it right or wrong on the end times when he doesn't even believe Jesus existed? Don't you think we need to be debating if Jesus existed first before you start talking about if he got it right or wrong? So I'm kind of confused about the topic, but with that said, I don't know if he cared or not, but that just seems odd to me. But again, that's a radical form of skepticism. I think it's preposterous to say such a thing. But with all that said, I wanted to just kind of highlight a couple of my thoughts that I got from the debate that I found to be very interesting and worthwhile. I think the cross-examination period of the debate was the best part in my mind, or my favorite part of the whole debate. The whole debate was really good, but my favorite part was the cross-examination. That's where you kind of got to see the worldviews in collision. I kind of want to touch on this for just a little bit, but I wanted to talk about debate in general. When you're debating an atheist and you're a Christian, you're starting from completely different starting points, right? Don brought this up in one point. He said, I'm approaching the text as a theologian, as a Christian, a believer, and you're approaching it as a skeptic, right? And at one point, Carrier was like, well, that's just not what we do. That's not how we interpret text in the scholarly and professional field. And I'm just like thinking, okay. But that's, you see, the worldviews in collision, okay? Carrier's an atheist. Don's a Christian. So worldviews are in collision. And it's like, people are like, oh yeah, but isn't that what debate's all about? Well, yeah, but you have completely different starting points. So you're going to come to radically different conclusions. I'm sorry, Dan McClellan, but there's no such thing as data over dogma, right? Your dogma or your presuppositions are always filtering and controlling the data. That's just how it is. We all have presuppositions. We all have starting points, and that ours as Christians is the truth of the scriptures, and atheists don't have that starting point. So that's why I kind of, find the debate to be, somewhat helpful to see, like, oh, what does he believe about this certain parts, certain part of scripture, to kind of see both sides on this. But other than that, there is no really any purpose in it. There's no changing of mind. I mean, you got to really get down further, deeper to starting points. Basically, what I'm saying is what worldview can give the preconditions or a justification for knowledge or truth at all. Okay? What I mean by that is, for a quick example, Richard Carrier is an atheist, right? He believes you're nothing more than DNA bobbing on the surface of a universe that did not have you in mind, right? You're just, the laws, if we can use that terminology. I don't think laws exist in an atheistic, materialistic universe, because laws are abstract entities, concepts, they're immaterial. Not only that, but law assumes uniformity, and you don't have uniformity and unity in an atheistic, chaotic world. But to give them let's just give it for the discussion here. Your brain is controlled by the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, right? In the atheistic, materialistic worldview, right? You're nothing more than just DNA, okay? What did Dr. Dawkins, Richard Dawkins say, in his book, River Out of Eden? Your DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Right? You have no freedom in an atheistic worldview. You have no dignity in an atheistic worldview. You're just the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, fizzing out its existence. So what's ironic is that Richard Carrier, I posted this on Facebook and I shared the debate. I said, what's ironic is that Richard Carrier would show up to a debate in his physicalist universe and act like there is such a thing as truth. And not only that, but it's ironic that he would show up to a debate and try to convince the opposition to believe what he is saying is true. There is no such thing as truth in an atheistic worldview. Okay? It's just the DNA, right? Fizzing out its existence. That's all there is. Okay? If atheism is true, physicalism, there would be no reasoning or reason to believe that it is true. Here's why. Because your mind is controlled by the laws of physics to believe what you believe. So Richard Carrier is determined by his brain fizz, if you will, to believe in atheism, skepticism, that Jesus wasn't a myth. My brain, or Don's brain, all of us who believe in Christianity, our brains are determined to believe in Christianity. So there isn't any reason or reasoning to debate, right? Yeah, in his worldview, there isn't. So I would say, if I was just talking with Richard Carrier, you showing up to the debate tonight already shows that you do not believe your position is true because you are assuming things that your worldview cannot account for. So that's what I'm talking about with starting points. I don't even think, like, one atheist challenged me, and he's challenges me before, and he's like, debate, and I'm thinking to myself, he was once a full preterist, and he's thrown in the towel. He's became an apostate. He's no longer a believer. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, oh, let's debate preterism, full preterism, if it's true. And I'm thinking to myself, like, dude, we're not going to be talking about full preterism if we talk, okay? I'm not going to be talking with you about 1 Thessalonians 4. I'm not going to be talking about Matthew 24 or how, that they experienced 1 Corinthians 15. I'm not going to be talking about that with you. I want to talk about how your worldview as an atheist can give a justification for reasoning in general, at all. How do you know anything to be true at all in an atheistic worldview? That's what I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about full preterism. I mean, that's coming from my starting point. I want to talk about how you, in your worldview, can give an account for anything at all. And what I'm after really is reducing your opponent to absurdity. But that's what I found very interesting in the whole debate. Worldview is in collision, and you're obviously never going to come to the same conclusion in a debate. You're never going to get to that because you have completely different starting points. But with that said, I wanted to talk about one of Carrier's main points in the debate that I find interesting. I kind of agree, and I don't at the same time. He was saying essentially that every time the New Testament authors are quoting from the Old Testament, they are engaging in pesher, interpretation is what that means. And he cites the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is true. They engage in pesher interpretation. Basically what that means is that they are quoting Old Testament text, he would say, out of their context, yes and no, and they would basically reinterpret it to apply it to their context in a completely different way. And he seems to think that when the New Testament authors are citing Old Testament text, that it completely negates, like radically negates, the Old Testament context because of pesher. No, that's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow, okay? I would say he's partially right. When the New Testament author quotes an Old Testament text, not all the time, but sometimes, a lot of time, but not all the time. Don points this out in the cross-examination. I'd suggest you would go listen to his response. It's around the 1 hour, 11 minute, and 30 minute mark, around there. Not all the time, though. So when a New Testament author quotes an Old Testament text, he's not negating the context of the Old Testament, but I would agree with Carrier that he is broadening it and applying a new or a wider interpretation in his context. Okay? So as preterists, we all agree with audience relevance, right? As preterists, that's what we parade, right? Audience relevance, right? So Carrier's right when Paul quotes Hosea, for instance. He's not negating Hosea's audience, right? Because Hosea lived in a specific point in time, prophesying to a specific people in time. That was his audience at that time. It had application in their time, right? So when Paul quotes an Old Testament text and he applies it to his context, he's not bringing the Old Testament prophets' whole context completely to the New Testament quotation and just saying it's a 1-to-1 ratio, right? What Hosea is talking about, I'm talking about. It's not always like that, okay? Pesher is broadening it. He's broadening the interpretation, making a wider scope to it. I mean, we do this all the time in the English language. I was just talking with my good friend Jordan about this earlier. I mean, think about this. The moon landing, right? What did they say? One, small step for man, one big leap for mankind. Yeah, we know the original context on when that was said and what the context was. But sometimes people quote it in a completely different context and apply it to a completely different context. For instance, building a house, right? You build a house, you say, oh, that's one, small step for man and one, big leap for mankind. I'm going to dig the footer today and lay the foundation block, right? You have applied that to a completely different context. It doesn't negate the original context, but you have taken that statement, that, quotation, if you will, and applied it to a completely different context. That's Pesher. That's what a lot of times the New Testament authors are doing. But Carrier seems to think this radical form of skepticism where just because the New Testament authors are quoting the Old Testament, it completely negates the original context. Like it's gone. No. That just like with the quotation of one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind doesn't negate the original context of when that was spoken. That's a non sequitur. Again, so I found that very odd that Carrier was pointing that out, and I didn't understand that. But here's an example of that. So I have this pulled up here. This is Hebrews 1, verse 3. Here's verse 5. Perfect example of Pesher right here. It says, this is the Father speaking to the Son, Jesus, and it says, I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me, right? It says, for which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I've begotten you, and again I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Now this is a quotation from 2 Samuel 7:14. 2 Sam 7:14. Now what's interesting here is this whole context is not talking about the Son of God, okay? The whole context here is Nathan talking to David, it's Yahweh talking through the prophet Nathan to David, and Yahweh is saying, you're going to have a son, David, and he's going to build a house for my name, David, and he's going to be like a son to me, and I will be his father. And look what the next section of the verse says that the Hebrews leaves out. He says, and he will be a son to me, and when he commits iniquity. Ooh, he's not talking about Jesus there. No. He's talking about Solomon. But you see how the New Testament can engage in Pesher. He's bringing the Old Testament context, that quotation, and he's applying it to a broader context and applying it to Jesus. Now, ultimately, we know that Jesus is greater than Solomon. He is the better Solomon, if you will. So it's not negating the original context in the Old Testament on when this was spoken in 2 Samuel 7:14, when the writer of Hebrews quotes it. But he's taking that quotation and he's broadening the fulfillment of it. I mean, this is again, common human language. We do it all the time. I feel like Donald Trump, but we do it all the time. It's just basic. So I don't understand how that negates the original context. That just doesn't follow. And Don, like I said, did a good job saying, well, not all the time that Pesher is being used, because Peter also quotes from Joel, says this was that, right? Joel was prophesying about the Pentecost, right? Tongues, all that stuff. And Peter says this is what Joel was talking about. So there you can have, there's a 1-to-1 ratio there, but it's not always a 1-to-1 ratio. So again, that's just a different interpretation I did not understand from Carrier. I was kind of confused about that. I hope that made sense. I'm sure I can go in further. I'm sure other people have better examples than that and can talk about more about that in the comment section. But I wanted to go over this because I asked a question the first time I gave a super chat on any channel ever before. And if you've ever given a super chat, you know that you're pressed for characters. You can only type but so many words, and when you're trying to pay a little money, you can only but say like 3 words, it seems like. So I came off $10 just to get this question through. And even then, I didn't even get all of the question that I wanted. I wanted to phrase it in a different way to make it more understandable, but this is the only thing I could get within the character limit for $10. And this is what I asked. I'm going to play this clip, and then I'm going to give some explanation before Carrier gives a response, and then I'm going to talk about his response.
So, Son of Man, thank you so much for the super chat. If the Gospels are post hoc in order to verify Christ's words, and Paul was writing pre-70, where then does Paul get his doctrine of imminent parousia if not from Matthew 24? Paul had Jesus' words pre-70.
Yeah, so this is what I mean by this. Richard Carrier says the Gospels were written post hoc. What I mean by that is after the fact, right? Richard Carrier believes that the Gospels were written after 70 AD, well on into the 2nd century. Now, what the problem there is that he assumes that the Gospels are purposefully implanting words into Jesus's mouth. This is common liberalism, common skepticism. They're just saying, well, you see, those Gospels were written way after 70 AD, and they place those words into Jesus's mouth to make him look like a prophet, right? To make him look like the Son of God, to make him look like someone who really knows what he's talking about. And again, that's a big, big problem. I mean, they assume all of that. There's a lot of storytelling in liberalism, but I won't get on that. But my point here is to point out that Paul, all liberal scholars, Dan McClellan, all liberal, Bart Ehrman, name them, they will all agree that Paul's letters were written pre-70. All of them. That's just a fact, it seems like. I hate to use that word, but that's just how it is. Paul is obviously writing pre-70. And that's pretty obvious. But the problem then lies, where does Paul get his doctrine of the imminent return of Jesus Christ? Where's he getting that from? If he's not getting it from Jesus's words, I would argue in the Olivet Discourse, where else is he getting it from? So my point is not to say that the Gospels were obviously written before 70 AD. I don't know. I can never verify that. No one could. But my point is to show that Jesus' words were pre-70. Paul had access to Jesus' words, whether he had the Gospel of Matthew or Gospel of Luke, whatever, don't know. But the point is that he had Jesus' words. He knew Jesus' words. And a good friend of mine, he said that, obviously in James, a direct quotation from the Olivet Discourse, James 5, I believe, says, the Lord is at the door. Jesus explicitly says that in the Olivet Discourse, and James is arguably, again, one of the earliest letters ever written in the New Testament. So where are they getting this doctrine of the imminent parousia? Where is the writer of Hebrews getting his doctrine of the imminent parousia if it's not from the Olivet Discourse? And I would argue that every constituent element of the Olivet Discourse is found in 1 Thessalonians 4. And again, all liberal scholars, name them, they would all agree that 1 Thessalonians 4, especially 1 Thessalonians, was probably one of Paul's earliest letters. So where's he getting his doctrine of the imminent parousia from? That's my question. So trying to show and demonstrate that Paul had Jesus' words pre-70, that the Gospels were not, in fact, putting words into Jesus' mouth after 70 AD to make Jesus look like a prophet. That's my question. I know it's complex, I know it's nuanced, but it's an ironclad question, I think. And this was his response.
So I assume that's to me.
It sounds like...
Yeah. So, obviously I go into this in detail on the historicity of Jesus, my book on this subject. But it very quickly, Revelation. So Paul says he got all kinds of teachings and even had two-way conversations with Jesus in his mind and believed that it was really Jesus talking to him. And that's where he got all the sayings of Jesus. So when he says he has a word of the Lord about how Jesus is going to come and save us, as he says it in 1 Thessalonians 4, he's talking about dreams and visions of Jesus that he believes are real.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next one is more a statement. I'm glad it's not a question. I know you have things to say. Don't worry. Check out the YouTube channel.
Yeah. So Carrier essentially says that, Paul had dreams and visions of Jesus in his head. Yeah, I understand. And to give Carrier credit, he only has like 20 seconds to answer this. I know they were on the speed round. They're at a crunch of time. So I'm not trying to lay into him too hard here. That doesn't cut it, my friend. That just doesn't cut it. To just say, well, hey, they had a dream about it or some sort of stuff like that. Yeah, that just doesn't answer the question. That's just not the way we do things in the theological realm, if you will. It's an obvious correlation. He brought up 1 Thessalonians 4, and I'm glad he did. I mean, look at the charts that Mike Sullivan's put together. Look at the charts that G.K. Beale, any good scholar put together, that 1 Thessalonians 4 is connected to the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' words. I mean, I have quotations after quotations from Charles A. Wanamaker from the New International Greek New Testament Commentary. He admits that 1 Thessalonians 4 is built upon Matthew 24, 30 through 31. So the question is this: where is James, in James 5, when he says the judge is standing at the door, right at the gates, right? What does Jesus say? He says the same thing in Matthew 24 through 25. He's saying the same thing. Where does James get that imagery from, if not from the Olivet Discourse, from Jesus' words spoken on the Mount of Olives? Where's he getting it from? I guess Carrier would say that James just had a dream about it or something. That's just telling a story. It doesn't answer the question. Like I said, to be fair, he only had like 20 or 30 seconds to answer that. But that doesn't answer the question. It's obvious from the New Testament authors themselves, the earliest letters we have, they obviously had access to Jesus' words on the Mount of Olives. Now, I'm not arguing they had all 4 Gospels in circulation. Can't prove that. I think so, but can't prove that. But the point is they had access to Jesus' words pre-70, a death knell to all forms of liberalism that say, oh, well, the Olivet Discourse was post hoc to make Jesus look like a prophet. Nonsense. They obviously had it pre-70. Ironclad, you're not getting around that. That's my point. And, I feel like Don, you could see he was, really wanting to get on that question. And I wish he had the chance to get on it. But that's a very, very crucial point that I wanted to cover, and I thought was very interesting that he just kind of resorted to dreams and fairy tales. It's like, that's not what Paul is doing there. That's just not what he's doing there. He's obviously doing what we would say an interpretation of the Olivet Discourse. He's making his connections to the Olivet Discourse. He's even adding things to his interpretation of the Olivet Discourse, right? He's intensifying, right, the language of the Olivet Discourse. That's just so clear. That's so clear that it's all built upon the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' words. So I hope you guys like this video, and if you do, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe to show support for this channel. That would be helpful to help me understand that you guys enjoyed this kind of content, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one. God bless.